Hello, welcome to our first ever virtual California High-Speed Rail Board of Directors meeting. My name is Justin Chichurk. I'm the multimedia manager here at the Authority, and I'll be running this meeting from behind the scenes today. Our hope is to replicate our normal board meetings as close as possible, but please bear with us if there are any bumps along the way. This is new for everyone. So with that, I will turn this over to Acting Board Chair Tom Richards.
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen from across the state of California, either listening or watching and listening on Zoom. Welcome to today's meeting of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board of Directors, April 21st, 2020. As Justin said, I'm Tom Richards. Like each of you, we are practicing distancing, social distancing, and working from home, as I'm sure many of you or all of you are. Therefore, we come to you from northern, central, and southern California today. Before this meeting is called to order, let me outline just a couple things on how we'll do business today. With regards to our public comments, which we will have as normal, Justin will manage the public comments, and any instructions he has for you, he'll give just before we start that. For those of us on the board, we are going to try to be careful not to step on one another whenever there are comments that a board member would like to make. We don't have a good way of identifying and acknowledging a member for his or her comments. We want to give preference initially for any comments, if we can, to the two members who are today joining us with audio only. What we also will do as board members, authority management, and staff will keep our phones, computers, iPads, etc. muted if and until we are going to make any comments. Also, the same will occur for any items which we have two today, which will require a vote. With that, the meeting of the California High-Speed Rail Board of Directors is called to order. Before calling the roll, it is with sadness and the highest respect that we acknowledge the absence of Lenny Mendonca. Lenny Mendonca, our board chair for the last 14 months. Lenny answered his latest call to public service from Governor Newsom about 14 months ago. In addition to leading the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, he also has been the chair board of this authority. Lenny has been a pleasure to work with and to learn from, and his seemingly quiet and understated approach to leadership he led and guided this organization and project forward. We thank Lenny. He is currently attending to family business and focused on his family. I am happy to report that they are all well, and we will and already do miss Lenny. Also, I'd like to note that we are now without a board member who has served us well for the last several years, Danny Curtin. Danny Curtin is now devoting all of his time to his professional responsibilities. He was a tremendous member of this board, one who we could always count on for speaking his mind, who was always prepared and volunteered his help regularly. It's quite clear to say and to conclude that he was committed to his beliefs and a sense of what is right. We will miss him, and we'll look forward to running into him over future years. But thanks, Danny Curtin, very much for the service he's provided. If we now could call the roll.
Good morning, Director Schenk.
Oh,
You'll be done. Unmute your devices. So
she should be unmuted now.
I thought I did. Director Schenk present by voice.
Vice Chair Richards.
Here.
Director Camacho.
Here.
Director Miller.
Here.
Senator Bell, Assemblymember Arambula, Director Perea,
Here.
Director Guilmetti,
Present.
Director Escutia,
Here.
Director Boutros.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. And you just heard a new name, a member of our board, Andre Boutros, was appointed by Speaker Rendon. Director Boutros comes to us after also having been pulled out of retirement, having spent over 30 years in leadership in California transportation in several senior positions with the California Transportation Agency and in his final duties as the Executive Director of the California Transportation Commission. He's a civil engineer. Speaker Rendon made the appointment, and we look forward to Director Boutros's participation in this board. He brings a level of experience and knowledge that will be of high value to us. Andre, if you'd like to say a word or two, you're welcome. If not, we can go ahead and move forward.
Move forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and welcome aboard, Andre. All right, we will now, we've got a flag, so we're going to all participate in the Pledge of Allegiance. We're not asking you to stand, but if you'll please, thank you. I pledge allegiance. Okay, if you can go ahead and bring your
Unmute.
okay. Then. I pledge of allegiance to the flag
Flag.
United States of America and to the
republic
for which it
for which
stands,
it stands,
one
one
nation, under God,
God,
indivisible.
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
for all. Thank you very much. We'll now move forward with the agenda. You'll note today the first item on the agenda is the opening remarks, which I've already made, and now we're going to turn the microphone over to CEO Kelly to talk about his comments on COVID-19 and to also present his CEO report this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Brian Kelly, CEO for the California High-Speed Rail Authority. I did want to start the meeting with a presentation on how this organization is reacting to the COVID-19 pandemic, some things that we put in place. Of course, we did not have the opportunity to get together in March. And so there are some elements here that I think some of the board members may be familiar with that I think are worth covering for public consumption purposes. And I'll roll through this as efficiently as I can. But again, this report will cover some developments that have occurred over February and March. Of course, along with the state and the nation, the authority has been adapting to and addressing the evolving circumstances associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The health and safety of the public and our employees is our highest priority. For us, it's safety first and safety always. We continue to take our lead from the governor's office and the state's public health officials. And as the situation changes, we will continue to adapt. At this point in time, I can report the following to all of you. First, the most effective way that we can address and implement social distancing has been through the utilization of telework capabilities. And the first thing I want to report is now more than 90% of our organization, about 93%, is teleworking on a full-time, part-time, or rotational basis. We've extended the use of emergency telework program beyond the original April 17th date to essentially until further notice. We'll be guided by what's going on external to our operations for how long we carry forward with the broadest possible telework capabilities. And then even when we have the opportunity to, quote, return to normal, I think we've all learned through this process that there is and are some advantages of continuing telework capabilities in some aspects. And so I see this being at some level a greater part of the organization's operations going forward. Anyway, embracing telework is the primary way that we're implementing the physical distancing policy. And as I said, it's very important in the fight against COVID-19. So I'm very appreciative with how quickly and efficiently our team has made a transition from an organization that essentially at one time had relatively no telework policy to really a 90+% telework operation. The other thing we're doing is we are embracing technological options to execute our work. Obviously, this board meeting is our best evidence and example of that. We began shifting external public meetings to virtual format in March, with open houses conducted in the Southern California region. For the foreseeable future, we will continue to utilize technology for external meetings, including public workshops and open houses. We're using best practices from our sister departments and the administration to ensure we're reaching as much of the public as possible, advancing our work, and adhering to physical distancing policies. I want to commend our strategic communications, multimedia, and IT divisions for helping us make this transition quickly and effectively. And of course, internally, we have an internal travel ban in place for employees, and we also do not gather in large groups in any one location. And so technology has been a great help in allowing us to move forward with our work and implement social distancing policies. We are also taking important steps to maintain safety at our construction sites. The public works construction remains an essential function under the state guidelines and all of the local and state directives to date. At our construction sites, we continue to work with the various unions, and most namely the Building and Construction Trades Union, our contractors, and construction management teams to implement best practices for safety at those job sites. We monitor and assess job site conditions every day, and we are fortunate to report that as of today, we have had no known confirmed cases of COVID-19 among the construction site workers or our contractors. Unfortunately, our freight railroad partner did have one confirmed case last month, to which we responded appropriately and in conjunction with our local public health officials to maintain safety at the work site. It's also important that all the board members understand that work is advancing during this period for us. So despite the COVID-19 challenges, we're seeing momentum build in the Central Valley construction. During the first week of April, we hit an all-time high of 821 average weekly workers dispatched to the construction sites, almost quadrupling our numbers from March of 2019. Last week, we had 806 workers dispatched to the site. We're also making significant progress on the guideway and structures, either underway or complete. As of the first week of April 2020, we now have 77 miles of guideway and 39 structures underway or complete, compared to 60 or 24 respectively in April of 2019. And by summer, we anticipate handing off 4 completed new bridges to local jurisdictions at Avenues 7, 10, 12, and 15. So progress is advancing. And while we recognize that, we also know we must do more. We know the pace must continue to improve. Clearing right-of-way and utility relocations remain the work that the project delivery team is primarily focused on, so that we can continue to gain pace on construction activity in the Valley. We're also making important progress on the environmental front. That's another important part for us, is that environmental progress and wrapping up the environmental approval process by the end of 2022 is part and parcel of our funding grant agreement with the federal government. On February 28th of this year, we released the draft environmental impact report and EIS for the 80-mile Bakersfield to Palmdale project section. This is the first draft environmental document for a significant project section into Los Angeles County, marking a major milestone for the program. In response to the outbreak of COVID-19, we elected to extend the public review period on this section from its previous end date of April 13th. We extended it out to April 28th, 2020. And we also changed the date and format of the public hearing from an in-person hearing of April 9th to a virtual public hearing now scheduled for April 23rd. This extension provided members of the public and stakeholders additional time to access and review draft EIS comments. Also, this coming Friday on the environmental front, we will be releasing publicly the EIR and EIS, draft EIR, EIS, for the San Jose to Merced project section. This document for the 90-mile section from Scott Boulevard in Santa Clara to Carlucci Road in Merced will be available to public comment for 45 days. During this time, we will host 3 open houses and a public hearing. And as the dates get closer, we will finalize whether the formats will be virtual or not due to the COVID-19 impacts. And then finally, in the environmental section, just looking ahead, our next EIR, EIS draft scheduled to be released for public comment will be the Burbank to Los Angeles section, which is set to be released at the end of May. This fall, we are on schedule still to certify the record of decision, the ROD, for the Central Valley Y segment. So we have a ton of activity going on in the environmental area, and it's important that folks understand that. You know, it had been about 5 years since the authority had adopted a record of decision or certified a record of decision for a project section. In 2020, we will have done 2 in the past year, and we'll have put out 4 new draft environmental documents for certification in 2021. So we really are advancing this work in the environmental area, and I'm excited by the progress we're making. I can assure you all that both the environmental team and the legal team and our regional directors are working hard to stay on task here. So while I report that progress, I also want the board members to be aware of some of the headwinds that we are seeing due to the COVID-19 virus. These are areas where we have to assess where we are, quantify these impacts, and continue to manage the program in the face of these things. And I just want to talk about a couple of them that are the obvious places we are seeing these. The first, which I know all the board members are aware of, is that the legislature did request that the final 2020 business plan be deferred from a May 1st adoption date to a July 1st, 2020 adoption date. And this really was in direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, the legislature went out of session for a while, held no public hearings, oversight hearings, or other hearings for a period of time. There is conversation about a return date sometime in May, but I think that remains a little bit unclear. They are beginning to have some hearings via Zoom and other technologies. But in light of the request to delay hearings, we thought it made sense to delay as well and meet the request of the legislative leaders to delay the adoption of the business plan. So our schedule now is to go ahead and adopt the plan and submit the plan to the legislature by July 1st, which will require us to consider it in our June board meeting hearing, and then, assuming adoption at that hearing, prepare the document for submittal to the legislature by July 1st. We have extended the public comment period on the document from April 12th to June 1st as well. And as I mentioned, we would then be poised to bring the document to the board at our June hearing and then make final changes to it for submittal to the legislature on July 1st. The other area where we're seeing some headwinds is in the track and systems RFP process. The current schedule for that procurement and those proposals to be submitted to the authority by the bidders is still set for the end of June. The procurement team is engaged with our 2 active proposer teams and is poised to adapt the timing and substance of the procurement further if necessary due to the COVID-19 impacts. What those impacts mean is still being evaluated, but the authority is aware that pandemic-related pricing, some market volatility, small business impacts, travel restrictions, and shelter-in-place orders present some challenges to this procurement that must be managed in the days ahead, and we are actively working with the bidding community on that. I will certainly be reporting back to the board any substantive changes made to that procurement process as we manage it going forward. And then the other area, I mentioned the progress we are making in the environmental area, getting the draft documents ready and released publicly, moving forward on the certification of RODs later this year. But it's also, I should note that although we are currently maintaining our schedule for issuing the draft environmental documents for all the public comment, we have received some requests, and we anticipate receiving additional requests from stakeholders and the public to allow more time for public comments. consistent with our past practices. If and when we receive these requests, we'll give them serious consideration, and we will keep the board apprised of any extensions we propose to make to accommodate public input while maintaining the program schedule. So these things are confronting us, and we continue to manage those. We are assessing those impacts on a day-to-day basis, and we'll continue to report to the board as we go forward. The last item that I will mention to the board today before I conclude I guess I have two more, but the other sort of major one I want the board to be aware of is that you're probably reading in the press or seeing in other media circles that there is talk at the federal level about a stimulus package that would largely focus on infrastructure and job creation as part of a COVID-19 recovery action item. And I want to tell the board that we are working closely with both the California State Transportation Agency and we're in discussions with the congressional delegation, certainly the House Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, to work on what that stimulus bill looks like. We are very encouraged to see a public statement last week from the House T&I Committee Chairman, Peter DeFazio, expressing support for investing in high and higher speed rail projects in the pending stimulus bill. And so we are working very closely with folks as that is being developed. I'll say that our project, we believe, is poised to help soften the devastating economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Stimulus funds would assure the expansion of a project that already provides more than 3,700 well-paying construction jobs and has already generated approximately 50,000 job years and about $9.2 billion in economic output. Benefits made possible by the Federal American Recovery and Reinvestment Act stimulus funds that we received in 2009 during the Great Recession and that have been matched by state funds since that time. We are uniquely positioned to quickly transform any federal dollars into jobs and economic output. First, we have two sources of state funds that can be used as match funds for any federal dollars made available for the project. And second, because we are already under construction and we will environmentally clear all of the MERCED to Bakersfield segment this year, we can put federal dollars to work faster and with more impact than many other less developed infrastructure projects. And third, we would also be able to advance the program and help close the gaps in the system by making strategic investments toward the Bay Area and the Los Angeles basin that would provide early benefits and lay the foundation for high-speed rail coming. So we are working very closely with folks on the development of that federal package, and we'll certainly be reporting to the board as develops warrant on that front. Finally, while I don't have them here today, I do look forward to the board meeting in person two of our recent hires at the executive level. I'm very pleased to welcome a new deputy for legislative affairs, our director, Jane Brown, who spent about 26 years working in the state Senate, is well informed on the legislative process and has great relationships in the legislature. And I've known her for some period of time, worked with her for many years in the Senate. And I'm pleased to welcome Jane, who joined us in April. And then as you may have recalled, for F&A board members, Joe mentioned Jennifer Loudon, who we've brought on board now. She's got lengthy expertise in the area of right-of-way management at Caltrans, and we brought her over to help us deliver our right-of-way on our right-of-way challenges. So Jennifer Loudon has also recently joined us, and soon I look forward to you all meeting them in person. They're both great additions to the team. That concludes my CEO report for now, and before we jump into the second agenda item, I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions I can answer with the board members.
Hearing no questions, Brian, please go ahead with the status of the 2020 business plan.
Okay. Justin, I think on this one, a PowerPoint presentation will come up on the screen here. This is something that I think the board members are going to be largely familiar with. This is the very similar PowerPoint to that used at our February 18th hearing. And I probably would not make the formal presentation here again, but for the fact that we didn't get a chance to talk in March, and it's been some time, so I thought I would briefly go through the business plan elements that I talked about at the February hearing. Again, I'll pause for questions, and at the conclusion of this item number, we can then go to public comment. And so I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman, at the conclusion of this presentation, if that's okay.
Very good.
Okay. First, just reminding where we are on schedule. We did get the request from the legislative leaders, both in the Senate and the Assembly, to push the adoption of the plan back to July 1st. As I noted, that moves our schedule back a little bit. The end of public comment period is moved from April 12th to June 1st. We'll be looking to adopt the plan now at our middle of June meeting by the Board of Directors. And just a comment here, our June's hearing is currently scheduled for June 25th. We will be talking to the board members about the possibility of moving that up by 1 week to June 18th. And the reason we would propose that is we want to just create enough time in between the adoption date by the board and time for staff to implement and make any necessary changes to the draft document to finalize it and submit it to the legislature by July 1st. So we think perhaps moving forward about a week to June 18th might help us be able to accommodate changes and make the presentation, get the document finalized for legislative submittal. We'll talk more with the board about the possibility of that date change. As it says here, the revised schedule does provide additional time for public and stakeholder comment, and importantly, for the legislature to hold oversight hearings of where we are, and of course, the opportunity to strengthen the final plan and address public comments. Next slide. The draft business plan itself had 5 themes. I covered these at the February hearing, but again, I'll go through these relatively quickly. I think the 5 broad themes that come out of this are: 1, California is the national leader when it comes to clean transportation, and high-speed rail is an integral part of that. What's meant by that is we certainly have put in place both goals and objectives for our emissions in California that really do lead the nation in terms of any kind of pollutant criteria, but particularly greenhouse gas emissions. In California, about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. And so we put in place both policy programs and funding streams over the years to allow us to invest further in cleaner transportation options, particularly those around the area of electrifying transportation, electrifying cars, buses, and rail. And that's really where we are. We are making important progress in that area. And of course, the impacts to greenhouse gas emission reductions by the full operations of an electrified high-speed rail system are impressive. And so we want to remind folks that we've been the national leader. We don't want to turn back. And it's while it's not just about this project, it is about continuing the push to electrify our transportation system. Secondly, the cost estimates that are contained in the 2020 business plan are largely in line with the cost estimates that we included in the 2018 business plan. We had a couple of particular adjustments that we noted in this business plan. First is because we are proposing to get to MERCED sooner than we were in past business plans by pushing forward a MERCED to Bakersfield initial operating line. We moved that cost into the valley to valley cost estimate, so there's a slight impact there. We also pushed back the delivery date for the entirety of valley to valley by a year, and so we did apply the inflation factor for that. But our estimates for the Central Valley segment, our estimates for valley to valley in phase 1 largely stayed within our 2018 cost ranges for the project, but for the 2 things that I just mentioned. We also note that the best use of the available high-speed rail funding that we have is to expand the Central Valley segment to MERCED, Fresno, and Bakersfield. We did spend a lot of time in the business plan talking about external reports that both that the board requested, one from the KPMG doing a business case for that stretch, and the other a side-by-side performed by our early train operator. Both ended with the recommendations to proceed forward on utilizing the funding we have to initiate an operating segment, and MERCED Fresno Bakersfield is where we would propose to start. The business plan does outline various benefits, mobility, environmental, economic, to move with that line. As we continue to put that line together, we would still advance all the environmental work statewide, consistent with phase one, and be in a position to move forward on the Bay Area extensions into Southern California as funding becomes available. Fourth, we note in the business plan there have been significant organizational changes at High Speed Rail, and we're pleased with some of the impact that we're seeing as we move the organization in a direction toward increased performance. Of course, it's not news to the board members. There's been a lot of change on the board itself. I think with the recent announcement regarding Mr. Mendonça, we now have 6 changes to the board in just over a year, which is pretty significant for a board of this size. And then, of course, at the management level, we've changed almost the entirety of the executive management team. And so we put in place a lot of new things, governance process, really working together in a new and positive way to make sure that we are focusing on outcomes. And I'll go through some of the impacts we're having a little bit later in this presentation, but we thought the issue of organizational change should be reflected in the business plan. And so we talked a bit about that. And again, as I said, we're starting to see positive impacts as we go forward. The last thing we want to note as a sort of a highlight from the business plan is that there are a lot of investments the state of California is making in passenger rail. It's not all about this project, and largely those investments can advance across the state while we work to deliver the MERCED to Bakersfield stretch that we have specified funding for. I think it's worth noting that outside of our funding stream, through cap and trade dollars, through the approval of SB1, there's on the order of $50 billion available over the next several years for non-high-speed rail, passenger rail investments in California, and there's no reason we can't advance on both fronts to move forward electrification of transit services in California. So those are sort of the highlight takeaways from the business plan. Let's move to the next slide, please, Justin. Obviously, as I noted, I'll go through this very quickly because we discussed this in February, but as I did note before, there are benefits of moving and extending the Bakersfield to MERCED stretch. The only section in the state where we can truly test out trains at high speeds, approaching 200 miles per hour. We get big reduction in travel time with that. We think delivering the 171-mile segment obviously has huge economic benefits. The estimate is generating more than 200,000 job years, and for the investment of about $20.5 billion, seeing 37 billion in economic activity. It also would fulfill our commitments to the Central Valley on permanent jobs and economic development that have been made since the conception of the program. I think I would just note here one more item that should have been on this slide, but it also enables us to demonstrate to the public and to the markets the operational value of electrified high-speed rail in California, and it gets the first building block of the entirety of the phase one vision approved by the voters from San Francisco to Anaheim going in California. So I think that demonstrates a positive sign both to the markets and to the public at large that this is doable and something that is functional and important, a game changer for moving people going forward in California. Next slide, please. Again, this is much of what I just covered, but as I said, the ETO analysis laid out some of these benefits. Expanding train service, reducing travel time does increase our ridership, and we think we estimate would lower the state operating costs for current passenger travel in the Valley today. It is affordable under our current budget estimates in terms of the low and high of our estimates of budget between now and 2030, and it does connect three of the fastest growing counties in the state of California. I did note that last bullet at the bottom, it does demonstrate public markets, a viability of operating high-speed rail, and gets the first building block of phase one done, consistent with what the voters approved back in 2008. Next slide. This is, I think, an important difference between really what the 119 miles does that is currently funded with the assistance of the FRA and other funding sources. The 119-mile southern terminus is at a place called Poplar Avenue. And of course, what we are proposing to do is extend that a little bit further to get out of a place that's sort of, as you can see in this picture, this depiction a little bit in the orchards, and get into the more urban area of downtown Bakersfield. And so we think this is a good demonstration of the benefit of bringing the high-speed rail system into the urban cores and extending beyond the 119 into the 171-mile stretch. That's the southern terminus. Next slide is the northern terminus. And so at the north there is the current northern terminus in the fairly suburban area here of Madera. That proposed site there is the current Amtrak station for the northern terminus of our work. And again, what we would propose under the 171 is to go and get into the urban stretch of downtown Merced itself. I think locating areas here is why we see the improvement in ridership versus the 119, obviously, but also the connectivity with other transit services, particularly on this Merced stretch. Our vision is to build this Merced area here with a terminal that would not just accommodate high-speed rail, but also ACE services and the San Joaquin services going into Northern California, the Bay Area, and Sacramento. Next slide. I mentioned that we're seeing some positive impacts from the work we're doing in the field now, and I just want to reflect and update with the board members where we are. This is a picture of our monthly expenditures by quarter over the course of the last year. This was discussed a bit in F&A today, but it does show growth of the work we're doing in the Valley. As you see in quarter two of 2019, our average monthly quarter expenses were about $22 million a month. We've seen slight improvement over time, quarter three, quarter four, and now the first 2 months of the first quarter of 2020, we're coming in at about $58 million a month just on the capital expenditures on the projects. And so again, I think we're really have found a way to tilt in the right direction. We have more to do here, and I don't want to pretend that we've solved everything, but our trend is going in the right direction. As we get this first order of work done in the Valley, get more of the right of way, the land conveyances behind us, we expect to see this expenditure chart continue to move up, particularly as we get through the summer months this year and into fall. Next chart. Similar trend line you're seeing, obviously, as you grow in expenditures, that should be aligned with seeing more and more construction work done, and more construction work means you have more and more workers being dispatched to the project. So this is another impact that we're seeing. As I stated earlier, growth from quarter two of 2019 into the first quarter of 2020. We've virtually doubled the number of workers that have been dispatched to the project on a weekly basis. Happy to report that in the first week of April, we hit an all-time high of 821 workers being dispatched to the project. We had some rainy weather immediately following that, and it dropped a little. And then through last week, we were back up to 806. So we're trending in the right direction on this as well. Next slide. This is just a snapshot of where we are on structures and guideway that has been cleared. Again, some of this is discussed in the F&A committee, but again, I think it's fruitful to let folks know how we are progressing on the project. You know, compared to about a year ago, we have now doubled the number of structures that are either in construction or completed, from 19 in January of 2019 to 39 now, and the miles of guideway that are cleared for work is up from 52 at the beginning of last year to 77. Again, these are good trends, and we must continue to get the first order of work done, out of the way, and completed, so we can see these trend lines continue to grow and actually grow at a faster clip. And so we'll be continuing to monitoring this closely. And of course, we report this monthly to the F&A committee. Next slide. I think everybody has seen this slide many, many times, so I will go extraordinarily quickly, but just to say that when you talk about the status of electrified high-speed rail in California, this map and the next one is really meant to show that we're in many ways, we're much further along than I think folks realize. You see that in 2020, we have in the Central Valley and Bay Area, 220 miles of, if we go forward with the Bakersfield and MERCED stretch, we continue to do the work in the Bay Area, more than 220 miles of construction, really project development work underway, getting us set for getting into full construction on those sections. We are still working on the environmental clearance for the dotted lines there into the Bay Area and into the LA Basin. And of course, we are seeing a rapid development of a new player that we're working closely with, which is the Virgin Train Lines in the LA Basin. They have both committed to electrified high-speed rail, and they brought in a new ownership team to move an additional 130 miles of electrified high-speed rail underway in California. So looking at this and then looking at the next slide, if you could, by 2022, the next 18 to 24 months, we will have completed all of the environmental work in terms of clearing each segment from San Francisco all the way to Anaheim. The Virgin Train project would be under construction, and we would be largely under construction in the MERCED to Bakersfield stretch as well as the Bay Area stretch. And so then it really becomes a question about getting the full funding. And we think that's the next task that we have to get to. But a lot of the project development work has advanced, and it's really important for us to continue to get this work done to see the project advance in California. But again, there's a lot going on, 350 miles under construction by 2022, and the full phase one system environmentally cleared with the addition of the Virgin Train Lines in Southern California. Next slide. That's pretty much the entirety of the summary of the business plan. Again, I did comment on this extensively at our February 18th hearing. We have received some public comments on the business plan, which we shared with all the board members immediately, and we are anticipating some legislative oversight hearings when they're able to reconvene or do those by Zoom or other technological method. And I'm expecting those will occur in the May timeline. Our comment period is extended to June 1st, and there are ways for the public to comment. I want to make sure that we're sharing this with folks. If you look at our website, you'll see a comment tab at www.hsr.ca.gov. You can email your comments directly to draftbp2020@hsr.ca.gov. Leave a voicemail with us, or of course, U.S. mail. So there are many ways you can comment on the business plan. Okay, I think that's the final slide. So that updates the summary of the business plan. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm happy to first answer any questions of the board members, and of course allow an opportunity for public comment. So I'll swing it back to you at this point.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any questions or comments for our CEO regarding the status of the draft 2020 business plan?
Tom, this is Henry. I do have a comment, a couple of questions.
Please go ahead, Henry.
Okay. Brian, first, thank you for the report. And I wanted to thank you and our staff up and down the state who have been doing a pretty phenomenal job just based on hearing your reports. There's a lot going on, so thank you. The two questions that I have to center around two parts of your report. One is, I understand there's a completion of the EIR completed to MERCED, and of course there's the EIR that was completed in the Bakersfield area. So the question, as we move forward to the final decision on the business plan, is there anything, and maybe there is work being done now that staff can work on as we're moving through this process? For example, land acquisition, working with utility relocations, et cetera, number one. And number two, we all understand the last few months, we know there are some questions or concerns regarding the Bay Area or LA with respect to them increasing funding for things that they want to do in their area. So we've talked about a strategy of increasing or building the pie. And I know with your comment about the Virgin system, are there any opportunities there working with the Virgin line and potential investors to increase funding opportunities for the LA area?
So let me take these in order. I'll start with your first question. Yeah, I mean, from where I sit, I certainly don't want to waste any work. And the fact that we have completed the environmental document into Bakersfield already, and we will have certified the environmental document into MERCED in 2020 on roughly a September timeline. We have not moved forward with project development work mostly because we have to come back to the board for approval, budgetary approval to do some of that work. But again, the intention here is not to waste the work that's done. And so I think what you will likely see from us, Henry, is from the staff, as we move forward toward getting the business plan in a finalized shape, I think we'd come back to you, and this is something we talked to the peer review group about, and they made comment to us, is to specify more directly with the board how and when we would begin some of the early works into those other areas, what form that'll take, what that looks like, and bringing that as part of the going forward process that we will articulate as we get to the final business plan. So I think you're going to see more of that. We will talk to the board more directly about those elements, and we will be more specific about timing related to that, because there will be a budgetary part that we will need authority to do that work on. So we will come forward with that as we get further along on the business plans. And of course, we also need to incorporate the concerns that we hear from legislative leaders and others in where we are and where we're going. In terms of the question of funding for others and the opportunities that Virgin perhaps brings into this. Look, one of the things that people have been waiting for a long time on the demonstration of electrified high-speed rail in California is private sector interest. And what I'm most excited about the current state of the Virgin project is that, one, they committed to electrified high-speed rail. The earlier version of that project was something different. Now it's electrified high-speed rail. And they are moving forward quickly, and they are doing it with private financing. We should be clear with everybody that even that project requires a full public partnership. While they are bringing some of the private financing, they are also working on a deal with the Secretary of Transportation for appropriate right-of-way from Caltrans, because they're hoping to build much of that project on the middle of the median of the I-15 freeway, so they have to conclude right-of-way work with the Secretary. We are working with them in conjunction on places where regulatory standards on safety and other things should not just apply to us or them differently, but apply to us the same. So for example, the Air Resources Board is going through a process now on how to credit the use of clean fuels on projects. And we're looking for an industry standard. We're developing a position with them on that. We are also looking to make sure that we are fully interoperable between the technologies we use and the technologies they use on their system. And I am routinely in contact with the leadership of Virgin. And then ultimately, extending into Palmdale on that project is going to be important to their ridership. And of course, the ridership numbers from LA to Las Vegas are very good. And we think, and I'm interested in seeing how we can develop a partnership to get not just to Palmdale, but ultimately south and further in the LA basin, perhaps together. So I see promise and I see potential, and we are working with them closely on a number of fronts now.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Henry. Any other questions from members of the board?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please go ahead, Director Escuti.
Thank you. Brian, I appreciate all the work that you've done. because it's, as well as I appreciate the work that the staff has done. But obviously, when COVID was finally recognized as a pandemic here in the United States, it basically changed the world. And so my question goes to the issue of finances. And in reading the business plan and the fact that, this vote will basically lock us into 30 years, there's been a lot of assumptions made on the business side in terms of financing. One of the assumptions is that there's a certain amount of percentage of money that you anticipate coming from cap and trade dollars. So in light of the pandemic and in light of the fact that some industries have gone down and we're basically in a recession, how do you anticipate plugging in the financial hole if the money does not materialize via cap and trade?
Well, adequate funding for this project has been a challenge since the inception of this.
Right, even in
project.
good times, right?
Yes, I mean, it has never, it's worth always reminding folks that, the day the voters approved the bond, they approved $9 billion for what was estimated at then a roughly $45 billion project. So it's always been a task of developing, consistent funding and stable funding for the project. That remains a project challenge. What we have achieved since that bond bill passed was the dedication of federal funds toward the project, and then a multi-year dedication of cap and trade funding toward the project. And so now we have a more stabilized sense of cap and trade extended out to 2030. But you are correct to raise the issue of the risk of that funding. We would have to go back to partners, federal, state, and others if cap and trade funding falls. I think what we would likely see on cap and trade is something we saw back in 2008 during that recession, which was there was a dip in cap and trade, but then when it was extended out to the 2030 timeline, you saw a rather robust recovery over time. I'm anticipating we will see some dip in cap and trade funding in the short term, perhaps. Right now, we are looking at that closely. The next auction is in May, and we will see what that looks like. But again, typically, as it occurred after the last dip in cap and trade, you tend to see it come back and stabilize over time. And so the long-term picture might be more stable than the short term. And I don't have entirely the same read that we're locked into something for 30 years without funding, because the structure of our track and systems contract, for example, is a multiple NTP, notice to proceed structure. And we're very clear that we won't get to the next notice to proceed beyond what we can fund in the short term in terms of the work being ready on the ground and funding be available to go forward. And the contractors and bidders are aware of that process and that approach. The other thing I want to say that I think is important for all the members to hear today is that you are correct that the COVID-19 impact, we are talking about it primarily as a public health impact, but the impact I think we're just beginning to get our arms around is the economic impact. And I think we're going to see, and I think the members should be prepared to see significant budget change in California due to this. And of course, an ongoing economic change, and how quickly we'll recover from that is a question. So I think what you're likely going to see as the business plan moves forward is probably from us a more cautionary approach in terms of our vision. I don't think the vision should change because we have the funding we have. We know what's available over time, but we may want to be and present it to you as we go forward, and we're getting more and more public comment and to the peer review group about this now, about how to address certain risks and perhaps describe it in a more risk-conscious way. And so I think that's some of the dialogue that you'll be seeing from us as we move forward on the business plan about, approaching some of these things and really taking into consideration probably reflecting a more cautious approach on how we get there. And so the vision doesn't change, but we got to be very clear on our step-by-step on this.
So as a follow-up, if I may, Brian,
Yeah.
So you're saying that right now you're having discussions with peer review with regard to risk, and you also mentioned, the word caution. Are we going to get anything from you in terms of these risk discussions, this cautionary approach before this vote comes down in June?
Yeah, I think yes, I'm going to update. I'll obviously update again where we are at the May hearing of the board. And the peer review group's letter is, they sent a letter to the legislature after some lengthy conversation with us about the status of the project. All those letters are being made available to you guys today. We got early comment letters from several jurisdictions that we'll make available to all the board members today. And most of the things that they commented on, I should say too, are already included in the KPMG report on how we go forward in terms of the risks and steps that we must take if we're going to move forward in this regard, and the things we have to get in line and the agreements we have to have in place with other partners before we proceed. So it will not be unfamiliar to those who have taken a look at the KPMG report, and so we will come back with more on this certainly before June. And part of it is going to be what is going on and how are we impacted by this COVID-19 stuff. It's something we are assessing on a daily basis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm. Director Schenk?
Yeah, thank you. I finally figured this out. There, nice.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, listen, what Martha brought up is obviously crucial, and Brian, you acknowledge that. So maybe we need to think about using this opportunity to bring on some future thinkers, whether it's from academia or from one of the big four, I guess four left now, or some group whose sole focus is the what ifs that Martha was touching on. It's not just COVID-19, it's anything, and we now learn anything can happen. And what are some of the potentials that if A happens, then B, or if B happens, then C, so that it's not just federal funding, not just private funding, not just cap and trade. What else could we possibly be doing in the terms of the mitigation, looking far ahead, thinking far ahead? We are, because of the nature of what we do, whether it's the board or the staff, we're consigned to a certain kind of thinking. I'd like us to see, based on what Martha started thinking in my head, if we can bring in some people with the fresh thinking, and again, maybe it is from academia, economists, whatever, what could we be doing, both in terms of funding as well as in changing the project, if necessary, in worst case scenarios. So just something to think about.
Again, we will certainly be coming back to you guys with a further picture of the risks that are in front of us, largely due to the COVID-19 matters. We have already communicated with the FRA that there are some change conditions on the project, and we will continue to monitor this. In terms of bringing in other folks to help, I'm, the board's pleasure. I'm happy to do what the board wants to direct. I just, at some level, some of these things are not all that difficult to understand. I mean, again, the project has not had full funding. It never has. Having a sense of what we can do with what we have is what we're trying to articulate now in the plan. And then I think it's right to overlay how does risk affect what we've otherwise laid out. And I think,
but not just COVID-19, but these dramatic kinds of events that 6 weeks ago we never even imagined. And I think that for very little or modest investment, we can get. And I keep saying academia because this is where there's sort of the freedom to think in a more of broader terms than some of the companies or consultants that we bring on who are more constrained. Anyway, just a thought.
Sure.
More about it.
I really would like to concur on the statement made by Director Schenk. I think it is critical that we start, in a way, kind of identifying, kind of doing a risk analysis, but from worst case scenario to the best case scenario. And I apologize for being a bit depressed, and I'm usually a pretty optimistic person, but I'm very, very concerned about us going down the path of a vote that will basically lock us in for 30 years. And I just really want to find out the financing, it really, really concerns me. So I think that the more eyes and ears and the more heads into this analysis, I think the better off we are. We would be a more informed board. Because like I said, the world has changed, But I would just like to also add one more thing, Brian. Obviously, everybody, superficially, when you look at this project, everybody says, "Oh my God, it's a nightmare of a project." Everything was just done in a crazy manner. So the question that I have for you is, what have been the lessons learned about this project, and how have those lessons learned, how have they been incorporated into this 2020 business plan? Because obviously we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past.
I couldn't agree with you more. And so I want to say two things. One, we are going out now to procure separate and independent risk analysis directly to the authority in real time. We're doing that now. We've been using our RDP partner for it recently, but we're gonna move in a different direction on that. And so that's a process that we have underway today. Look, the lessons learned we laid out in pretty long detail in the 2018 business plan. I also think it's something we'll say more about in the 2020 business plan. But to be very clear, I think the key lesson learned for us is exactly what you're articulating. Nobody here wants to go forward too fast. And I think what the lesson that I take from where the history of the project has been is this. They got into construction too soon. They got into construction before they had the right-of-way in hand, the project did, and before all the utility relocations were known and understood. And we are still living with that consequence today. Now, there were good and understandable reasons to do it. The federal government gave the authority $3.5 billion and gave them a date certain to spend it all by. So the authority got going. The upside of that is that you have construction advance in the valley, and you have thousands of people working, and you have 500 small businesses working on the project. The downside of that is we've been playing catch up on right-of-way since that time. And it's caused us to have to deal with delays that the contractors then bring to us because we're not out of the way. So the primary lesson learned for me is don't get too far ahead of yourself going forward. I appreciate that. That's what I'm taking from the experience. We're definitely going to apply that in how we would advance to Bakersfield and MERCED, get to the next construction segments. And I want to apply it to the track and systems contract as well. I don't necessarily agree with the categorization that it's a 30-year locked-in thing, because while there is a 30-year maintenance element on the track and systems contract, it is structured in a way to have very specific notices to proceed only when the work is done and the funding is in place. And the bidders are aware of that as we go forward. And so I don't entirely see it the way you do in terms of it being a locked-in thing. But that said, the lessons learned to me are clearly don't get into stuff before we get the fundamentals in place. The construction contracts is the primary place we're seeing that. You will not see us get into construction contracts on the extensions before we have a better handle on right-of-way and utility relocations. And so you'll see a much more, you'll probably see us recommend to you, procurement options just for that work before we get into the full construction elements of that. But I also think it's important that we are very specific about what we're doing with what we have and what the vision is and where we're trying to get to build out the entirety of the project. In several ways, this project is not different than any other transit project in terms of you have a vision for the totality of it, but you only have what you have in hand at the time. And what are you doing with that? And that's what we're trying to lay out in this. There's a building block approach that we put into place where we can demonstrate the benefits of the technology. We can provide mobility benefits, provide obviously economic benefits, but also do it in a way where we are not jumping too far ahead of ourselves and be very cautious as we go forward. I do think the COVID-19 thing introduces some new risks that we'll be coming back to the board about as we monitor those.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have one for Brian.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the KPMG report, and I went through that thing fairly thoroughly.
Mhm.
And they did point out the risk factors. But all of that was prior to COVID-19. And I think that there may be some additional risk that we need to factor in as well. So we can't look at the KPMG report as a total recommendation without the impact of COVID-19. And I think that was one of the reasons I had talked about a risk manager earlier. We haven't had one for a couple of years, and probably we need that type of expertise now.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree.
All right. Thank you, Ernie. Any other comments?
No.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian. We're going to move on to item number 3 on the agenda, which is the consideration of the February board minutes.
Tom, I'm sorry. Before we get to that, did you want to jump to public comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's not in the right place. Okay. All right, Justin.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We have 11 people on here for public comment, 10 via Zoom, 1 on the phone. We will go through the 11 who have entered via Zoom first by alphabetical order by first name, because that's how Zoom separates you. Then we'll go to the phone last, because that one's just a little trickier. So I'm going to start the public comment now with Adrian Brandt. Adrian, you are in the meeting, and please give your comment.
Sorry, I accidentally had my hand up. I was not meaning to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to David Ikegami, and I apologize if I've said your name incorrectly.
No
David,
problem. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I just wanted to read a brief statement. My name is David Ikegami. I'm here on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Little Tokyo Business Association and the Little Tokyo Business Improvement District, speaking in favor of Speaker Anthony Rendon and Assemblymember Laura Friedman's plan for a 125-mile-per-hour express rail service in the greater Los Angeles area that extends from the Burbank Airport to Union Station and Anaheim by 2024. We are pleased to add our support to their proposal as outlined in the 2020 CHSRA business plan. Little Tokyo, a community of over 400 predominantly small businesses that will soon welcome Metro's regional connector hub, has grown into one of downtown Los Angeles's most vibrant districts and a desirable destination with ideal proximity to Union Station, LA Civic Center, world-class museums, popular restaurants, shopping, and more. We feel strongly that adding key improvements in Southern California and the Bay Area while continuing high-speed rail construction in Central California will maximize future mobility and connectivity throughout the state, while also meeting the needs of the diverse and culturally rich communities along the corridor. Please approve Speaker Rendon and Assemblymember Friedman's plan as proposed. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we have David Schweigel. Go ahead, David.
David Schweigel, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, David Schweigel from Apex Civil Engineering here in the Fresno Clovis area with 3 items. First off, in making the case, here's a tip from the Cascadia mega region that succeeded in attracting private sector tech investment. A $24 to $42 billion system carrying the passenger equivalent of a 10-lane freeway, generating $355 billion in economic activity, and achieving cross-border collaboration among the best and brightest medical minds to find a vaccine for COVID-19. Second, think California for all, such as enhanced collaboration among the Fresno EDC, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, and the Greater Sacramento Economic Council to lay fiber optic cable within the right-of-way of HSR to bring tech to the Inland Valley, 5G broadband to the numerous households that are currently without, mine being among those, and achieve the next ag-tech breakthrough. Third and finally, a shout out to the Ultimate Corridor Express on MERCED to Sacramento and Stockton to San Jose, the poster child for being faithful with little, trustworthy with much, and perfectly positioned to capitalize on the innovation corridor concept that we are seeing success within the Cascadia mega region. Congressman Jeff Denham's office deems ACE getting into the true high-speed rail business an excellent idea. They've just launched an EIR, and I personally testified at every single Sacramento Cog board meeting for 2 years on how this project from ACE will bring unprecedented legislative accountability and economic development benefits statewide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schweigel.
Sir, next up is Denny Zane. Denny, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Right, my name is Denny Zane. I'm Executive Director of Move LA. Move LA is the organization which began the coalition building and campaign development for Measures R and Measures M in the Los Angeles County area. And I'm calling because I would like to encourage you to take very seriously the proposal submitted to you by Speaker Rendon, Assembly Member Friedman, to divert some of the funding to investments in both Northern and Southern California. I looked at this from the, I guess, vantage point of what's the real goal here is not an operating segment. The real goal is what positions the project to be fully complete. We're just going to set us on the trajectory where it's a fully funded and completed project, and whether the proposal you have on the table does that, or whether a proposal which would also invest in Northern and Southern California would do that. And I would tend to look at this as if it were a statewide ballot measure. Which of those arrangements would be most likely to generate the levels of support needed, get the funding needed for a complete project? Not just a segment, but a complete project. And I think there's a strong case to be made that the Rendon-Friedman proposal would better position this project toward completion, what's now on the table for you. And I would like to encourage your discussion of that option as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zane.
Next up is Eric Reese. Eric, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Eric Reese. My comment for future consideration would be for the board and staff to work with the Capital Corridor JPA Coast Rail Coordinating Council and the Transportation Agency for Monterey County in acquiring the Union Pacific tracks from Gilroy to San Jose. Acquiring the right-of-way would consist of partnering with Amtrak to use Amtrak's eminent domain ability to acquire the tracks at fair market value. By acquiring the right-of-way from Union Pacific, this allows the High-Speed Rail Authority to build the majority of high-speed rail tracks within the existing right-of-way, thereby minimizing the need to take properties outside of the right-of-way and allowing for the authority to build the high-speed rail tracks in the most cost-efficient way. Buying the right-of-way also creates a unique opportunity where the authority and Monterey County could jointly upgrade the corridor from San Jose to Gilroy to become a high-speed rail corridor, resulting in a grade-separated corridor and travel speeds up to 125 miles per hour. This allows for reduced travel times. This would work similar to the planned shared use for the Caltrain corridor. By purchasing the existing right-of-way, the authority would be able to build the most preferred alignment for the San Jose to Gilroy segment, while also allowing other agencies like Caltrain and Capital Corridor the ability to expand their service to Salinas. Thank you for your time and consideration of this important proposal that can achieve many benefits out of one cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Next up is Jose Flores.
Mr. Flores?
He is not unmuting, so we can try him again in just a moment.
All right.
Next up is Liam Kelly.
Apologies, I don't have any questions either.
All right, thank you very much. Next up is Roland LeBrun. Go ahead, Roland.
Yes, good morning, Darius. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. So very briefly, I would like to echo the comments that Brian made about the benefits of telecommuting. And in my mind, the FNA meeting we just had was the best FNA meeting I've ever been to. And this board meeting is right on par with it. So I hope that moving forward, you will consider continuing with this format even after the current situation is over. With regards to Virgin, I think that what we need to do there is to watch and learn how they are doing high-speed rail ride, starting with alignment and the resulting cost savings. They're going to build this for approximately 20% of what it is costing us to do a high-speed rail. I mean, talking per mile of what is costing us to do high-speed rail between MERCED and Bakersfield. And that concludes my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lebron.
Let's try Jose Flores one more time, see if we can get him in here. It does not appear that's going to work. So the next gentleman to speak, I only have a first name, which is Steve. So Steve, if you could give us your full name and go ahead and give your comment. Well, his is also not unmuting. So I guess we'll move on to the next person, which is Walter Beaumont.
Yes.
Go ahead, Walter.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate this. I'm speaking on behalf of the Eco Rapid Transit Joint Powers Authority. Our Executive Director, Michael Kodama, could not be with you today. Eco Rapid Transit is a joint powers authority with 11 members, 10 cities, and the Burbank-Glendale-Pasadena Airport. We work together to improve transportation and connectivity through the cities, and our corridor is 40 miles long, and it will link the Hollywood Burbank Airport to downtown Los Angeles and eventually to the city of Artesia. We support recent proposals by Assembly Member Speaker Rendon and Assembly Member Friedman to fund interim rail improvements. We were encouraged to see the recently concluded presentation that contemplates advancing rail investments across the state. There are 4 million residents in our corridor, and over 3 million residents in California have filed for unemployment. And this is all due to the economic crisis that is caused by the COVID-19 crisis. There is no doubt that rail improvements in our corridor will help in the economic recovery for our residents post-crisis. So we encourage you to spend some money down in our corridor. Our residents are depending on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaumont.
All right, and our final comment comes from someone on the phone. I'm going to unmute you. You will hear a prompt that says you have been unmuted by the host. Please go ahead then, give your name and your organization if you have one. Go ahead, caller.
Good morning. This is Mike Behan, Deputy City Manager from the City of Palmdale. Just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the board members, Mr. Chair and CEO Kelly. We have submitted a letter dated April 15th on the business plan, relatively minor comments, but the reason for the call is to show support for the project in the California High-Speed Rail Authority. We've hearing Palmdale several times in the conversation today is very exciting. We are very eager to have high-speed rail here in Palmdale, and we'll echo what Board Member Perea said. Coordinating with Virgin Trains and Express West is highly recommended, and I know that's happening, and I would encourage that to continue. Also coordinating with Metrolink, Metro, and SCAG so that we have a good collaborative effort. And lastly, I would say that we are wrapping up our station area plan, which we'll present to our board in late summer, early fall. And I would just say stay the course and everybody be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Behan.
I would like to give Jose Flores one more opportunity because he's still logged in. See if we can unmute him. Jose, if you can hear us, if you can unmute yourself, you can give your comment. No, I don't think that's going to happen. So that concludes our list of people here for public comment, sir.
Thank you for managing that, Justin. Appreciate it. We will now move on to agenda item number 3, which is the consideration of the February board minutes. Assuming there are no changes or additions, may we have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
By Director Perea, second, please.
Second.
Okay, is that,
Camacho.
oh, sorry, Ernie. Motion and second, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any objections?
I will
Right.
abstain since I wasn't there, Tom.
Okay, and I think probably Director Bukas will do the same thing. All right, so we'll have two abstentions and the balance are ayes. Moving on to item number 4, the Los Angeles Station Link Union Station Funding Plan.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Brian Annis, the Chief Financial Officer at the High Speed Rail Authority. And I'm also joined by Frank Vaca, our Chief of Rail Operations. And I think soon, technology willing, we'll be joined by Phil Washington, the Chief Executive Officer at LA Metro. Justin, next slide, please. So this is an action item. Staff is bringing to the board the funding plan for Link Union Station, or Link Us, Project Phase A. This is a facility that will be part of both the Burbank to Los Angeles high-speed rail segment and also the Los Angeles to Anaheim high-speed rail segment. The funding plan is prepared in compliance with Proposition 1A requirements that are in Street and Highway Code Section 2704. This is happens to be the third and final funding plan brought to the board associated with the appropriation made by the legislature in 2012. In 2012, the legislature appropriated $1.1 billion for the bookend projects. And with previous funding plans, this board approved $600 million for the Caltrain electrification project and $77 million for the Southern California grade separation at Rosecrans and Marquardt. That's has been one of the most dangerous grade crossings in California as designated by the Public Utility Commission. So this again is the third and final. What's proposed is $423 million of Proposition 1A bond funds for the Link Us project. In this presentation, we'll describe the project. We'll briefly outline the authority funding plan that was prepared with help from our financial advisor. We'll also talk about the independent consultant report from the company called PFAL. That's a 1A requirement for an independent assessment. And lastly, we'll talk next steps, including the formation of a project management funding agreement, and that defines the roles and responsibilities of both the authority, LA Metro, and partners on the project, and is an important oversight document going forward for the authority. The best way, I believe, to introduce the board and the public to the project is with a video that's been prepared by High Speed Rail Authority. It also includes animation from LA Metro, and I believe Justin is not ready to play that.
The piano, you're allowed to fluctuate, having sort of an ebb and flow.
For 80 years, the corridors of the historic Los Angeles Union Station has ebbed and flowed with passengers. But unlike the piano player, train service here has seen little fluctuation.
Union Station, when it was built in 1939, is a stub-ended station.
That means a train must enter the station, load and unload its passengers, then wait until cleared to leave the same way it came in.
So trains tend to idle.
Idle, sometimes for as long as 40 minutes. A long wait for riders and not good for the environment.
Since 1939, Los Angeles Union Station has connected communities across the Los Angeles region.
But that's where the Link US project comes in.
It will transform how regional rail trains operate in Southern California.
The more than $2 billion Link US project will convert LA Union Station from stub-in to run-through.
We will build run-through track structure over the US 101. It's going to curve along Commercial Street and connect back to the mainline tracks along the Los Angeles River.
The project, being partially funded through an agreement with High Speed Rail, allows Metro to use $423 million in Prop 1A funding.
It's a big investment for us, and it's important for the region. With service to the Gold Line, high-speed rail.
As part of the agreement, the Link US project will make room for future high-speed rail use.
What I'm most excited about, what we bring, is the ability to bring people into the region on fast, efficient, clean service.
The changes will reduce idling time to fewer than 5 minutes, while increasing rider capacity by as much as 60%.
We serve about 100,000 passengers a day. Within 9 years, we fully anticipate serving over 200,000 passengers a day.
The new landscaped West Plaza.
Link US will also provide a facelift for the 80-year-old station.
Our intent is overall to modernize Los Angeles Union Station to make it truly a world-class transit and regional rail terminal station.
The rebuild of that station is in all of our interests, so local and regional transit systems can operate better, expand services in their area.
Forming a future of rail travel that should be music to the ears of all Southern California travelers.
Great. Well, thank you, Justin. This next page shows you the project from above, and this is both phase A and B in this particular slide. But you can see from the left the tracks coming in to the current stub configuration. There's one way in and one way out, and those are the tracks on the left. You can see designated highlighted in yellow here, the viaduct that will cross over Highway 101 and then connect at the Los Angeles River to the right. In the station area itself, the tracks will be elevated further, and the platforms elevated further to connect to the viaduct over 101. And also, as you can see in the video, the terminal area is widened underneath to allow more space and more commercial opportunities as well. I could get the next slide. This slide starts to segment what is a part of the Phase A project, which is funded and in this funding plan, and the future Phase B. What Phase A includes is work in the throat area, which is the existing tracks coming into the station to improve the signaling and track structure there. Also the commercial and Center Street area, which is the touchdown to the right to make it a run-through track. Segment 3 here is the viaduct and the run-through, and that'll include 2 initial run-through tracks, one raised platform. And what's shown here is Phase B, or Segment 4, is the modernization, expansion of the concourse, and ultimately the elevation of the remaining track and platforms, so that at the end there's 7 raised platforms that can be run-through tracks and use the viaduct. Can we get the next slide, please? So on this slide is the funding plan for Phase A. High-speed rail is the largest single contributor in this funding plan. The funding plan here with Prop 1A includes $423.3 million. We also show in the next line prior contributions to the project, which the board approved a few years ago, of $18.7 million for some of the initial planning and design work. About $12 million of that was ARA funds, and the remaining is Proposition 1A funds. Most of those are expended. Then the second largest contributor to this project is the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, which is a Senate Bill 1 and cap and trade funded program run through the State Transportation Secretary, David Kim. With those high-speed rail and that funding source, you can see over $800 million is being contributed by the state toward the total project cost, which is $950 million for Phase A. There's also significant contributions by LA Metro through their 2 sales tax measures, and the SCRRA, Southern California Regional Rail Authority, or Metrolink, contribution is $40 million, and it's rounded out by a CalSTA and Caltrans contribution of $5 million from another SB1 program, the State Rail Assistance Program. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the board has taken prior action regarding LA Union Station project. Of course, way back to the 2012 business plan, the board established the concept of blended systems or bookends in both the north and the south, the Caltrain corridor and the Anaheim to Burbank corridor. Also in April of 2012, the board adopted a resolution to adopt the Memorandum of Understanding with Southern California partners that specified different priorities for investment. And the LA Union Station project was actually the highest priority project in the Southern California MOU. In February 2016, the board adopted a direction to fund the development of LA Union Station, and that's the $18 million I mentioned in the prior slide that has mostly been expended to date. And lastly, tying to the May 2019 board action, where the program baseline was adopted at $15.6 billion, that did include and does include the $423 million Prop 1A bond for the LA Union Station project. Next slide, please. So, pursuant to the requirements of 1A and included in your board package, there's a couple different studies and plans. Our funding plan, prepared by the authority and our financial consultant, does include the requirements of 1A, including a description of the usable segment for high-speed rail, which is in total the Burbank to Anaheim segment, sources of funding, which I just went through. It articulates the ridership and operating revenue initially for the Metrolink and Low-Sand Surfliner Amtrak services. But this facility and the capacity it adds does create that capacity for future high-speed rail. And as part of the agreement with LA Metro, the authority is gaining operating rights for that facility, and LA Metro owned track in the area as well. Secondly, there's an independent financial advisor report prepared by PFAL, and that report also describes the project, the feasibility of the project. It looks at things like contingency and schedule, and it also lays out some risk assessment and mitigation strategies. I wanted to describe those in a bit more detail because some of these strategies recommend inclusion of certain items in our project management and funding agreement to reduce risk for the authority. There's actually 6 of these recommendations. Number 1, there's a recommendation that the PMFA specify the maximum amount of Prop 1A funds for the Phase A project, and it, as directed by the appropriation, that is the $423 million. 2, specify design approval for the authority during construction and operations to ensure the project is consistent with the operational needs of the authority. 3, specify the operating rights for high-speed rail and site access for future high-speed rail improvements. 4, specify dedicated uses of the Prop 1A funds for the project. Again, we're a bit over 40% of the funding for the project. 5, specify risk mitigation in the occurrence of project default to protect the authority's investment. And lastly, require that commitments are established formally from the many funding partners to fund the project. Next slide, please. In the package to the board, there's a draft resolution that includes the following. First of all, for the board to designate the Burbank-Los Angeles corridor and the Burbank LA to Anaheim corridor as usable segments, consistent with the Prop 1A requirements. 2, that the board approve the Link Us this funding plan for Phase A. 3, that the board direct the executive officer to finalize the funding plan and submit to both the legislature and the director of finance for the required 60-day review period. And lastly, direct the CEO to begin negotiations with LA Metro on that project management and funding agreement, which is a requirement of the legislature's appropriation from 2012. Again, this is accountability and oversight document, and when that is negotiated with LA Metro, the resolution would direct that come back to the board before it is finalized with LA Metro. I also, again, have on the line Frank Vaca, our Chief of Rail Operations, and Phil Washington, I believe, from LA Metro is now on. Hello, Phil. Maybe we could first, if we could unmute Phil and receive any comments he wants to make at this time.
Well, thank you, Brian. Metro is very, very excited in partnering with the California High-Speed Rail Authority to enable a future high-speed rail service to LA Union Station. We appreciate High-Speed Rail's contribution of $423 million to this Link US project. The Link US project is really going to transform the way Amtrak and Metrolink operate in Southern California by converting Union Station from what was talked about in the video, from a stub-in station to a run-through station. It's going to also significantly impact the regional rail capacity while accommodating, of course, a future high-speed rail service at Union Station. Your investment today, board, will provide immediate benefits to the commuter and inner-city rail system that connects Metro's local transit, bus, and rail service. LA Union Station is the largest multimodal transit and rail terminal station in Southern California, serving approximately 36 million people or passengers annually, of course, equal to the entire population of the state of California, and up to 200,000 passengers per weekday by the Olympics of 2028. So we respectfully request that you support staff's recommendation to approve the Link Union Station funding plan for the construction of Link US Project Phase A, which is a part of the Burbank to Los Angeles and Los Angeles to Anaheim segments of the high-speed rail system. And lastly, let me say that it's been a pleasure to work with CEO Kelly and also Mr. Brian Annis. We have spent a considerable amount of time working on the MOU, and we look forward to working on the project management funding agreement as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Washington.
Mr. Chair, I believe that concludes the presentation. Myself, Frank, and Mr. Washington are certainly available to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Then thank you very much, Mr. Annis. We'll now open your presentation up for questions or comments from the board.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. This is Martha.
Yes,
And
Martha.
my question to Mr. Annis is, I noticed in one of your slides, the map that has Union Station and the all the area around it. And what really caught my attention was the William Mead housing projects. And so my question is, what efforts have been made to integrate the community to basically find out how they feel about this? I'm just trying to, the more transparency there is about this, and speaking to those homeowners at those at that housing project, I think the better off we are. This is a great project, and I just want to make sure the community is all on board.
Sure, I certainly invite Mr. Washington to comment if he has any specifics. I can say the CEQA process has been completed on this, so there would have certainly been outreach. But Phil, do you have any specifics on that to add?
Yes, we have been in contact with the William Mead Homeowners Association, or the folks that represent that development. We'll continue to do that. We know them very, very well, not just for this project, but we are connected to that community just on our projects in general. So we will continue to work with that community to make sure they understand what the project is, and to also find ways that we can hire some of the residents that actually live in the William Mead homes. We have been not just been doing outreach to talk to them and inform them about the project, but we have been talking to that community and other communities about how they can get involved with helping to build their own communities. So that has always been very, very important to us, and we will continue with that.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. I really, really am very happy to hear you say that as you go down the path of this wonderful project, that you do incorporate the community, especially trying to lift them up and trying to make sure that they also get the economic benefit of this kind of a project. So local hire is very critical, as well as local training. I mean, some of these individuals, they just need to be trained for the type of jobs that are anticipated. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Martha. Yes, other comments, please.
Tom?
Yes.
Just wanted to ask Phil and perhaps our Brian what is the process going forward, and what is the time frame for this to happen?
I can maybe address the shorter term process. What Prop 1A requires next is that we submit this to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. We'll also submit it to the peer review group that the authority has for comment. Typically, there's a 60-day comment period. If the legislature has any comment, they'll provide it to us, as well as the Director of Finance. Per the requirements of Prop 1A, the Director of Finance will make a finding that the project can be completed as proposed. And with that, we proceed to finalize the project management funding agreement, which is really the final step to be able to release those Prop 1A bond funds. And I would then defer to Phil Washington on maybe the project schedule beyond that.
Thank you, Brian. I have my engineer, Rick Clark, on the line, and he probably can address the specific timeline better than me. Rick, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, this is Rick Clark. I'm the Chief Program Management Officer at Metro. So we're going to do this project construction manager, general contractor. That's where we bring the contractor in during the final design so that they can have input and make it a more constructible, cost-effective project. So we're going through the procurement process for that right now. That will go through the summer and into the fall. And then we'll bring the contractor on board. There'll be approximately 2 years of construction, of design, and then we'll launch into construction in 2023 will be the start of construction. And we hope to have it done before the Olympics in 2028.
Yes, that's where my question was backing into. Hopefully it'll be done before the Olympics.
Absolutely. That is our plan, this project and several others.
Very good. Thank you. That's my only question.
I have a question. Tom?
Yes, Director Pereira.
Yeah. Brian, just to confirm that there is 100% funding in place for this project, number one, and number two, what relationship, if any, does this project have with what was previously mentioned? I understand Speaker Rendon has a project that he submitted. What is the relationship between those two, and what is the funding path for that project?
Well, as far as the commitment of funds, all the funding partners are committed. We'll formalize those somewhat going forward in the PMFA or other agreements, but the funding is committed for the Phase A, the full $950 million that we had in the presentation. If you're a Director Pereira, alluding to some of the prior discussion and work of our early train operator, we have considered this one of the existing projects that's funded and going forward. So this was, if you remember, in the early train operator analyses, kind of your future state with funded projects, where we had LA Union Station and the growth associated with it in that analysis. And so that's this funding plan is centered just on the Phase A Union Station, which again is that early work, the viaduct, the initial run-through tracks, 2 stations, and Phase B, I know, is not currently funded, but parties are very interested in pursuing that funding and getting that second stage moving as well.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Brian Kelly. I just wanted to add in answering Board Member Pereira's question, just in terms of the priority for the project in the region, we had back in 2012, the authority had worked with Southern California partners on an MOU indicating where bookend type dollars could or should go. And since that time, we've worked closely with Mr. Washington and others in the region. And this LA Union Station redesign and rebuild was ultimately the #1 priority down in that region. So just to give you a sense of these dollars, whether they're going to a high priority project in that region, there's no question about it. This was, of all the projects that were contemplated in an MOU, this was ultimately identified as the highest priority project. And that's the key reason that we're using our funding to bring it forward.
Thank you, Brian. Other questions for any members of the team?
Yeah, Tom, I had that second question with respect to the relationship of this project to the project that Speaker Rendon has submitted.
If I could on that too, there's more of a general idea to move funding to a project or projects in the region. There is not a specific project that's been proposed by Mr. Rendon.
And is this, Brian, is this moving funding from the authority's project?
Yes, I think that the reference that was made earlier was to the idea of moving funding out of the valley that we are proposing the 2 other regions. There is, but I just want to be clear with Mr. Pereira that there's not a specific project that's been identified as the recipient of those funds yet. It's just a sort of a conceptual thing at this point to move funding to other regions, but not a specific proposal on where that funding would go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for any members of the team?
Not a question, just a comment, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. So as I listen to this, and I know we have so many new participants, not just board members, but staff and others listening in or making comments, it's, as Brian and Tom know, and Ernie, it's a little quirk of mine to call this a bookend, because the original legislation that I sponsored as the BT&H secretary in '81, and then when I was in Congress, anticipated this to be Los Angeles, San Diego, Los Angeles, then is now the second busiest Amtrak corridor for passengers. So I just want to make sure that in our thinking and in our maybe wishful thinking, that we not forget that this isn't the end that, yes, Union Station was part of it back in the 80s. And so maybe we're backing into it by getting to Union Station. And why I'm so much in favor of this is because of the hope that we will eventually get to the second largest city in California and the busiest Amtrak corridor, that is between Los Angeles and San Diego. So I'm very much in favor of it and applaud all of the efforts that have been put in over tremendous obstacles, I will say, funding not the least of which, to get to this point. So thank you, Brian, to you and other Brian and the staff for getting us here.
Thanks for the refresher, Lynn.
Well, that's what happens when you're the artifact, say, for ancient history.
Any other questions or comments from members of the board? Hearing none, just a couple of quick questions. I was just interested, Brian Ennis, with the date of the 950.4 estimate, roughly, if we don't know exactly.
You meant the date?
Yeah, when was the estimate completed?
I believe we were doing this analysis in the fall of 2019.
Okay. And with regards to the estimate, then it's with the full concurrence or understanding and input from our partners at the LA Metro. Is that yes? It is.
Yes.
Okay.
We were thoroughly involved. Yes.
Okay, great. If there is, and you know, it's clearly based upon everything we've read, it's fully funded. If there are any overruns, how will they be handled?
Well, I think that the PMFA would speak more to that issue. You know, our ability through the Prop 1A is capped at this 423.
Exactly.
Through the prior agreement we have, we want to work cooperatively with LA Metro on a funding plan for the Phase B. But again,
sure.
Phase A, that we're capped at this 1A amount of 423.
Okay. Well, clearly the PMFA is incredibly important, and I'm sure that every board member will be reading it carefully. Our obligations with regards to management is pretty clear. And so I'm certainly more than hopeful, and I'm sure that we'll be integrated clearly what obligations and responsibilities the authority has. I share with, I think, the other commenters, I'm very excited about the project and moving this forward for the system as a whole, and certainly in the nearer term for our friends in Southern California. And certainly the parameters within it with regards to the amount of contingency, I assume inside that, so the contingency number, roughly 32%, still looks good to us, because if this was just done in 19, there's probably not been any drain on that contingency on costs that we are aware of now that we weren't aware of when the estimate was done. So with that, I'll ask for a motion for approval from the board.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Sorry, it's Brian Kelly. Just sorry to interrupt, but just because we're doing this technologically, we were having some problems bringing in board member Boutros, who I think wanted to comment.
Was he? Okay.
So I just want to check with Justin to see if we've remedied that at all.
I'm not sure. We're trying to get a hold of him now, and unless he can hear us currently.
Is he on his cell phone, Justin?
He had called in earlier, and then he lost audio, and we've been trying to reconnect with him. So far, it doesn't appear that's been successful.
Okay.
You're here, Henry. Good thing you're here.
Let's just hang on for a second or so. I would have assumed that he might have had something he wanted to add to the discussion here.
We did make an attempt to reach him from the office here in Sacramento, but we were
Okay.
unsuccessful.
I'm going to try the same thing right now.
Brian Annis?
Yes.
It might be worthwhile to outline the interest that he raised with you, just so we have that and can go forward in that manner. I think if we can't reach him, we otherwise need to find a way to accommodate the concern.
Sure. Yeah, in our briefing.
Excuse me, Brian. Andre's on the telephone. Andre, are you hearing what we're talking about? Andre is hearing us. He can't get through. I'm going to put you on my speaker and see if in the wild chances it might be picked up. Hang on. Andrea, can you say something and let's see if there's a way to hear you?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Oh, perfect.
Yes, we can hear you. Do you hear him, Lynn?
Yes, I do.
All right, then, Andre, please feel free to go ahead and make your comments at this point.
On this particular item, I think Mr. Ennis covered quite a bit of the risks that were identified and the recommendations to include some of the language in the project management and funding agreement. I would actually suggest that the adopting resolution includes reference to the recommendations in the KPMG report for clarity and for record moving forward. So we do reference the consultant report already in the adopting resolution as a document to be submitted to the Department of Finance. I think it's appropriate to include those, or at least reference recommendations included in the report to be incorporated into the project management and funding agreement. That's my recommendation and my input on this item.
Thank you, Andre. And for clarification, when you mentioned KPMG, did you mean the PFAL?
I'm sorry,
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the project finance.
Yes, advisory.
Consultant, right.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, yes.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, if as I mentioned, talked to Commissioner Boutros earlier, and we could, if the board was entertaining it, add an extra sentence to the resolution to say something like, the CEO is directed to ensure that the recommendations made by the authority's independent consultant are addressed in the project management and funding agreement. And of course, that PMFA is already by the base resolution coming back to board for approval.
All right, thank you, Brian. Andre, did you hear that clearly?
Yes, and that works for me.
Okay.
Is that a motion?
Go ahead, Ernie.
I said, is that a motion?
I was just going to ask Andre, is that your motion then, Andre?
That's my motion.
Okay. Is there a second, please?
I'll second.
Okay. Director Camacho, please call the roll.
Director Schenk?
Yes.
Vice Director?
Whoa.
Echo.
Wow, that was...
Vice Chair Richards?
Yeah.
Tom, I think you need to hang up with.
No, I thought I already did.
Director Camacho?
Yes.
Director Miller?
Yes.
Director Perea?
I just wanted to confirm that the motion is to approve all items recommended by staff. If the answer is yes, then my vote is yes.
Director Guillemette?
Yes.
Director Escutia?
Yes.
Director Boutros?
He made the motion, so I'll have to, hold on. Let's just so we can, I've already hung up on him. Do you want me to, I can recall him. I guess make it just exactly right. Hang on one second.
Yes, Andre.
Okay, your vote, Andre?
My vote is yes.
Okay, thank you.
The motion passes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Washington and Brian Annis and your team. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you,
Thank
Phil.
you, Chair.
All right, moving on to item number 5 is an update to the high-speed rail program economic impact analysis. Brian Annis, you're still on.
Sorry about that delay, some technical issues. Yeah, this is an informational item, Mr. Chair. This is the third update of our economic impact analysis. The authority staff has done this as the fourth time. We do this in the financial unit with some economists that we consult with that help us put it together. Can I get the next slide, please? As indicated, we started this in the 2015-16 year, looking at the impact of the project to date. Next slide. So we have 3 main economic indicators that we look at through this reporting. One is we look at the number of job years that have been created through this project. And a job year is essentially a 1 year-long full-time job. And of course, that is really composed of all different types of jobs. You could have one employee working for 5 years would equal 5 job years, but you could also have 5 employees working for 1 year, and that would also be 5 job years. And finally, 10 half-time employees working for 1 year would be 5 job years. The second major category is labor income. And that's all forms of employment income, including compensation, wages, benefits, and payroll taxes that firms pay to their employees, and also the income earned by self-employed workers or unincorporated sole proprietors. Third, economic output, which is the estimate of the value of all the economic activity created by the project, and that's all the investment that high-speed rail makes directly, as well as what's sparked by that spending in some other areas through multiplier effects of the investment. The next slide. So in terms of economic effects, we do have the direct impacts, which are the payments the authority makes to its contractors, and those then go into the salaries and wages from the employees of those contractors. But also we have indirect effects to the left, and that has to do with things like the supplies we purchase. When we purchase concrete and steel, of course, that increases payment from those suppliers, and those employees benefit. And on the right, we have induced effects, and that's the things that those salaries and wages enable in the community. They enable more housing production, more retail sales, and of course, employees of those establishments also benefit indirectly through the high-speed rail investment. Next slide. So this, we put together these estimates really through 2 primary methods. The first is bottoms up. We review the contract and the invoices, conduct interviews, site visits, and determining the spending by project activity by geographic location. And secondarily, we utilize standard econometric models and to apply the multipliers to get some of the indirect effects from the spending. When this analysis was first put together 3 years ago, we did have the methodology validated and reviewed. So it was reviewed by the University of the Pacific, the State Finance Department, the Department of Labor, and also our peer review group. And so those groups endorsed our methodology, and we've continued to use those same methodologies going forward. Next slide. So going through and updating our economic impacts through June of 2019, we estimate that the project has created upwards of 50,000 job years, and that the last year of contribution, or the 19 fiscal year, contributed 7,500 job years to that total. Next slide. In terms of labor income, The estimate is that the project has created up to 3.6 billion of labor income, with the fiscal year contribution in 1819 being 600 million. Next slide. Lastly, economic output, or really contribution toward gross domestic product, are 5.7 billion spent on the project through June of 2019 has produced as much as 9.2 billion in overall economic activity, and that again includes those multiplier effects on jobs and wages. And the 2019 contribution toward that was 1.6 billion. Next slide. So this slide starts to break it up by region. The greatest share of the project expenditures have been in the Central Valley, or more specifically the San Joaquin Valley. And there, through the program, it's estimated that about 19,000 jobs have been created. Coming in second is in the Sacramento region, but you also see significant economic activity in the Bay Area and Southern California. In each area, about 5,000 job years created. Next slide. And this starts to look forward a bit. This is looking at the cumulative economic impacts upon completion of our current scope. This is the Madera to Poplar line, but also the environmental work and the bookend projects that are funded in our baseline. When those are completed, our total job years of employment created are estimated to be 162,000, and total economic output about 30 billion. Next slide. This expands the prior slide to add the Bakersfield and Merced extensions, and that would increase the estimated job years of employment to 208,000 and the economic output to 39 billion. Next slide. This slide is looking at the valley to valley specifically and excluding the work south of Bakersfield. And that has a job year estimate of 222,000 and an economic output of $50 billion. Lastly, for the overall phase one program, it's estimated the job years of employment created upon full completion of the project would be 624,000 job years. And the economic output would be 131 billion. The next slide. So to wrap up, as a project delivery organization, high-speed rail has many benefits on the economy that ripple beyond just the immediate construction. And again, these are benefits that are just looking at the value of the construction. It doesn't get into the value of the project during operations. The authority has created thousands of jobs across all functions we've performed, environmental, engineering, and construction. There is a sustained employment that we see across the state, as that prior slide indicated. And in the Central Valley, specifically the San Joaquin Valley, that was the region hardest hit by the Great Recession. And I think that's one of the reasons the federal grant was designated for the Central Valley. And again, in that region, over 3.3 billion of economic activity has been generated from the project to date. The authority's contribution has been part of the broader economic recovery in the region, and as comparison, at the height of the Great Recession, the unemployment rate in Fresno County was 17%, and it's decreased to 7% in 2019. So we know we are certainly part of that reduction in unemployment. For those employees directly employed on the project, that's very significant, but also for the region as a whole, we've made a significant contribution to the economic recovery. Next slide. And we do have all of our supporting documents and research available at these links on the High Speed Rail website, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions from members of the board? Hearing none. Brian, great job. Thank you. We'll move on to the Finance and Audit Committee report. I will edit this because, as best I can from comments that have already been made earlier. Finance and Audit Committee met just prior to this meeting. We reviewed one audit that had been completed by the internal audit staff, which had to do with the work plan development process, looking at our rail delivery partners, contracts, regional consultants, and PCM. There were two recommendations. Both were accepted and have been implemented. The internal auditors will take a look for follow-up at a later date. Find both the audit and the plan and recommendations acceptable. Looking at various finance metrics, the cap and trade, I think Brian had mentioned it, the cap and trade auction in November was 184.4 to the authority, 153.2 on February, a reduction of 31.2. However, the last 4 quarters at 732.2, those are millions. The budget, as you recall, our low range budget was 500 million a year. So we're substantially greater than that at this time. Question mark is raised earlier, the implications of COVID. We'll be taking a close look at that during the next 2 or 3 auctions, certainly. We've mentioned the Director of Risk Management and another approach towards filling the risk management responsibilities with a outside consultant contracted directly by and to the authority. The 1920 fiscal year budget, which is 2.255 billion. In terms of expenditures, we're substantially less than where we would be normally with 2/3 of the year completed. We're at 41.7. It looks to me that we'll likely be somewhere on the spend rate. We're currently on at somewhere around 70% of the budget expended by the end of the fiscal year. With regards to state match for the ARA funds, as you all are aware, we've got a state match of 2.5 billion roughly necessary. We've already have had approved by our funding partner, the FRA in Washington, 407 million. Currently at FRA and pending is another 890 million. And we have matching additional invoices in process of several $100 million right now. It doesn't look to me, at least, that we've got major concerns or issues with meeting the match requirements by the end of 2022. On our small business utilization, we increased over the previous month by 0.9%, up to 21.8% as compared to our aspirational goal of 30%. Contingency that was budgeted, we have $2.6 billion left out of the 3.6 that was originally incorporated in our 2019 budget update. On our construction status, as has been reported a couple of times, the rate of construction is certainly increasing. It's encouraging. As Brian Kelly has said, it's not where we need it to be, but the trends are all in the right direction and certainly are supported by the number of people on the job. Last week was 806. 2 weeks before that was 821. The week in between was reasonably low because we had rain down here in the valley pretty much the entire week. We are closely monitoring row requirements as we have in the past. The reporting on row with the GeoAmps is certainly a huge advantage. The reporting format that Joe Hedges has put together with his team is going to be much more helpful to us in evaluating where we are on row and at what point a failure to deliver on any portion of the row on a month-to-month basis, we can take a look at the impacts on the construction schedule. And as was mentioned earlier, the management and staff are rebaselining that schedule. We'll expect to take a look at that at F&A at next month's meeting in May. And there will be following rebaselines that we'll be looking for into the early summer that have not been defined today as of a time schedule. So that is the Finance and Audit Committee report. Are there any questions?
Tom, I do have a comment and a question. Just my comment or suggestion is maybe that we move Joe Hedges' report to the top of the agenda for F&A, because it seems to get shortchanged at the end. And being in the Central Valley, where we're kind of ground zero for construction, and especially meeting our ARA deadline, I'd like to have more detail early on and not miss that in the discussion at the end. The other piece then goes to that construction. And I know I've been having a little bit of problem finding the continuity in the reporting of what's happening here in the Central Valley. Specifically, there were 11 structures that were behind schedule, and I think we're only down to 9 or 10 now. Right. But still looking at Ventura, looking at Tulare, looking at Fresno Street, the shoe fly. I mean, we're talking about 6 underpasses that need to be constructed with supporting structures. And the Chinatown folks recently advised me that there's been a little bit more of a delay on the shoe fly. So I just think we need more exact and detailed reporting with respect to what the issues are. If they're third party, if they're land acquisition, more detail in terms of what those are and where we are specifically in meeting those timelines so that we begin construction. So it's my comment.
I think those are good points, Henry. Today was an unusual situation in that we really needed to get out of the F&A meeting in an hour in order not to delay. But typically we don't have that constraint. We can clearly, and do often run pretty close to an hour and a half. But I'll keep in mind what you said with regards to not shortchanging his reports, simply because they're extremely important.
Right.
Okay. And I would also certainly encourage you or any members of the board to take up Joe's offer of sitting down with any of you in the in-between board meetings to give you more specific information, and especially with regards to construction here in the Valley, Henry. So as you probably know, he's here generally 2 days a week. So I'm sure that could be set up if you'd like to make the time for that. Okay, that being said.
Tom,
yes.
Glenn, I pressed the raise my hand, but I don't know who gets to see it. Sorry. First of all, Tom, I want to thank you very sincerely for taking on this additional role, not just chair of F&A, which is a tough duty, but chairing this in the interim till we get a new chairperson. And under these difficult circumstances. So thank you very, very much for doing this. Just a question. Ernie has brought this up many, many times, and you mentioned it in your report about a risk manager. Let us ask, if we could, staff to think about how we would go about creating that role, funding that role, where it would fit in. Frankly, you know, I'm on several corporate boards, and we have a variety of risk committees, and the staff reports directly to the board or to the board committee. Rather, there's a dotted line, of course, to management, so there's coordination. But if we could get maybe for our next meeting some feedback on how we can actually move that particular ball forward.
Okay, thank you. We'll make sure that we address that. And as you well remember, when John Tapping was in the role, that he did in fact report to us. So
right,
it's a big hole in our management right now, and I am certainly happy with the alternative if we can't find an individual in the challenge to at least we need to have a consultant on the board directly responsible to the authority as soon as possible.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. And that's a while ago, early March, in response to the LA Times writing a story about a whistleblower that was told by our program manager, WSP, not to give bad news to the High Speed Rail Authority. I had asked the previous chairman, as well as Brian, whether we would consider doing an independent investigation of that. The reason why I asked that is because the program manager, WSP, basically investigated themselves. And they obviously found that there was no harm done. I would feel a bit more comfortable, obviously, in order to protect the integrity of this project, as well as to protect the integrity of the workplace, if this board would consider having an independent analysis of that as to what happened. I just don't think it's a good idea for program managers to investigate themselves when it comes to these type of situations of whistleblowers.
Thank you. Good points. I can just add to that. The week before last, I talked with the CEO of the RDP. He has already initiated, and this is a part of what you were, I think, a part of what you're talking about, but I'll get to being directly responsive to what your questions were or your comments. They have initiated an independent report investigation of this also. They have indicated that should be done in the next couple or 3 weeks. We're certainly interested in looking at it, but as to your comments about doing something on an independent basis, we've already talked with our own independent auditors about scheduling this. It's slightly delayed. I was interested in having us have that material that is being developed from the RDP's independent consultant, so that we can look at it and integrate comments and questions. In addition to that, recognizing that we perhaps don't have all the resources in our internal audit staff, we're probably will be by an F&A recommendation to the board, coming back to the board with a request for funding for an outside partner, so to speak, working with our independent audit staff to provide the expertise in the areas that we don't have, both in taking a look at what the RDP presents us with of theirs, as well as our own investigation as to what happened.
Tom, can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Just to put a finer point on some of what's going on since that came out. First, I do want to say that my view is that whatever that claim, I do not think it affects the operations of the authority in terms of, I think it's very hard to argue we do not put out bad news. I feel like in my time here, my 2 years here, I spent my time doing nothing but put out bad news. So I want to be clear on that point. The second point is the RDP has contracted with an independent law firm today to do a further review of the matter from their perspective to inform both them and us on where they are. And we want to get that information, understand what the results of that is before we decide what our continued actions are, what suggestions we'll bring forward. And the third thing that I want to say, because this is something that gets right to the heart of my view and my time here, is I do think that it does push up an issue that is a structural issue with our organization. And that to me is just how risk is done. We've been relying on the RDP itself to provide the risk analysis for us, and they do it. There's nothing inherently wrong with how they do it, but for perception purposes, I think it's a much better idea that we have independent risk analysis that comes both to the board and the independent management. And we have begun the process to do a scope of work for exactly that work. So I think there's a structural issue that we'll get to. We'll figure out what the report says from the independent review underway. We'll come back to the board with another action item based on what we've learned after we get further information on where this is.
Yes, great. Thanks,
Well,
Brian.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the efforts that you're making in this area, as well as thank you, Brian. My point was not to suggest that these type of situations of whistleblowers or us not taking the bad news, in no way did I mean to imply that that's going to stop the project. What I want to do is to basically assure the integrity of our actions and the integrity that we expect of our contractors and subcontractors, and to also protect workers in a very difficult environment. But I thank you so much for the effort you're making.
Thank you, Martha. Brian, Kelly, did you have anything else today?
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't, other than to just sort of broadly and publicly thank the members and the members of the public for being patient with us as we've gone through and come to this first virtual meeting. I will say I don't know if I want this to go on forever, but I'm happy to say that I think we're learning things about technology that even at a time when we return to some sense of normalcy, I think there's the tools that we can make more available in our routine operations, and we're learning a way to do this work more efficiently. And so there's an upside to all this.
Well, it looks to me like you're enjoying this pretty well. So at any rate, thank you, everyone. And for those around the state who are still with us, please be safe, practice all of what we have been told to practice, because it's working in California, and that's something to be proud of. And hopefully it has not impacted any of your family or friends, and we work through this, but let's don't give up on something that we're already succeeding in. So with that, my best to our colleagues on the board, the management and staff, thanks for a great job. Have a great day, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Chairman.